Yo, what up, everybody? Welcome back to Turn Bark Time. I'm the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
And we are still here a long time. Barker, this is season 6, episode 5. Bark, how you doing? Little catch up. Obviously, we got caught up after Christmas. Apologize for taking a break last week. Had essays to grade. So Mr. Ramsey, Scott Ramsey, our fearless leader, has graciously allowed me to go ahead and surpass that last episode. But Bark, I got a big shout out for you and for my basketball team. So shout out to Barker. If you haven't seen these, they are freaking awesome. The Pirate Energy shirts. I had a bunch of girls nervous for our first basketball game against Chelan today. And they basically were like, Turner, we're so nervous. And I was like, girls, we're just going to exhibit Pirate Energy. And they looked at me like I had spoken French. And so I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, okay. So I had like a quarter zip on, took the quarter zip off, and I showed the shirt. And I go on the back, right, for those of you, and I don't know if I spin. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to spin. But it basically says, Barker,
swing your sword with great technique and without hesitation.
And they were just like, ooh, I like that. And so we ended up going out there today. Shout out to our girls team. This is our middle school team, and we won 35-22. So it was a pretty good dub. And again, exhibiting that Pirate Energy. We're going to carry this. This is my new coaching shirt. Like, I'm going to wear this underneath my Quincy gear because I love it. So again, shout out to the RA Long Jacks. Barker, this is freaking dope.
Our boys team, shout out to our boys team who's number 3 in the state right now.
Yeah, let's go.
Actually, well, we'll see because we beat Washougal by like 30 tonight, so that'll change the RPI. Big one coming Friday or after tomorrow.
Yeah.
We play Columbia River, who's 8-1, and beat us. So we're on the second half of the schedule, and we lost by 1 point when we played at River. So
all right, give them heck. Yeah. So love that.
Start of the new semester, so start off on the right foot.
Yeah, please. We'll say it at the end of the episode too. New semester, new you. Let's go. Right. Remember, your GPA follows you everywhere, except if you're in middle school. Then it stops. So, hey, cool episode tonight. Current events, but not as, I guess, controversial as could be talked about at the moment. But we were going to talk about naming things. The original episode was actually going to be the discussion of oranges and what kind of came first, the orange, the color, or orange, the fruit. We can spoiler alert that one. It is the.
Well, I think it's. I'm trying to remember now.
I know the answer. That's why I'm so pumped about this.
Oh. I've looked this up numerous times.
It's the fruit. The fruit is the first thing. Yeah, the color is named after the fruit, right? Because the question, I think we were talking about last week, the question, one of the deeper questions was, why didn't we call a banana yellow if we call an orange an orange? And it's because oranges were around long before. We used it in, I think it's in ancient China. They use the term orange, and then that alone becomes the color of that. And I could be wrong, but I want to say that's something along those lines. Actually, no, it's not China. Nope, it's gone. This is why you always check your sources, because if you don't remember, you got to have it ready. But speaking of naming things, we are going to talk about geographic naming of things, and can you change those said things?
Renaming.
Correct.
Changing the name.
Correct. So if you have not heard, there is a push from President Donald Trump to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and to rename the mountain known as Denali in Alaska, tallest mountain in North America, back to a original name, not original, that's not the right term, a previous name of Mount McKinley, named after the President of the United States.
Yeah, it's part of presidential action that is, according to the White House website, restoring names that honor American greatness, which it goes on and it talks about, I think renaming Denali as Mount McKinley is section 3, which happens actually, and then the Gulf of America is section 4. So if we want to start with the Gulf of America or the Gulf of Mexico, I think it's kind of interesting. This is the one. This one's the quicker topic in my mind.
Yeah.
Because it's never been referred to as the Gulf of America.
Nope.
This is a complete new idea, but there's also like there's no rule that says that two political entities have to refer to a body of water by the same name.
Yep.
A prime example of this, some of you may know, some of you may not, because you live in Quincy and I'm not there anymore. My wife and I spent 2 years living in Kuwait, which is right next to a body of water that, for all historical purposes, is often referred to as the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
But if you live in one of the Gulf Arab states, they call it the Arabian Gulf, or El Khalij Al Arabi.
Very nice pronunciation.
Yeah, my former Kuwaiti students will probably come back and say I screwed that up, but I gave it the old college try. But I'm a Khalij, right?
Yep.
But that didn't happen. It was never. They actually go back and they would refer to like 10th century historians calling it the Persian Gulf that wrote in Arabic. So like Arabian chroniclers called it the Persian Gulf. And then it wasn't, the term Arabian Gulf didn't come around until the 1960s when there was the big pan-Arab movement. And so like they were trying to exert political agency. And so, I mean, that's what I kind of see with this, trying to rename the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, is it's kind of this idea to like take pride in the fact that like we own it. Because Mexico, the reason it's called the Gulf of Mexico is that Mexico used to extend all the way around what today would be the state of Texas and up until like where the Mississippi comes down in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Right. So it was the Gulf of Mexico, and plus Spain also owned Florida for a time. Right. So it was at one point called the Gulf of New Spain, Nuevo España.
Yeah.
But I don't know. To me, as a history teacher, and like we're nerds. We come in and we see a globe or we see a map. We immediately go over and try and figure out how old it is based on what countries are there, what countries aren't there.
Yeah.
If the Soviet Union still exists or not, or
is it good one for you? So we were doing a lesson in Sidetrack. We were doing a lesson in my leadership class, and there's a guy by the name of John Goddard. Have you ever heard of him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so John Goddard made his list of 127 things he wanted to accomplish in his lifetime. And on that list is he wants to climb, he wants to photograph Victoria Falls. Barker, where's Victoria Falls at?
Victoria Falls.
The African one.
I was going to say it's by Lake Victoria, right? Which would be down there.
So. Anyway, the point that I was making with this is that when he writes it, he wants to do Victoria Falls in Rhodesia. And so I was like, guys, do you know what's wrong with this? Or do you know what's off about this list? And one kid's like, no, nothing. And I was like, there's a problem. And it's because Victoria Falls is now in Zimbabwe, not Rhodesia. So I was like,
Cecil Rhodes, not a good guy.
Yeah. So the other thing I noticed too is like it gets Mexico. If I understand correctly, Mexico comes from an Aztec word, correct? That is where they
the origin of the word Mexico is from the Nahuatl term for the people of the They didn't call themselves the Aztecs. They called themselves the Mexica.
Yeah.
Or Mexica.
Yeah.
But so I mean, like, again, we're kind of going with this thing. Like, is it an indigenous name? Like, technically, Mexico is derived from an indigenous language, Nahuatl. Yeah. Which gives us like any of those great Spanish names with like TLs or X's. because Spanish doesn't use those. They're also, I don't think they're present in Conjobal, which is the Mayan, like the derivative of the Mayan language. But yeah, like Mexico is a derivative of Mexico, which comes from the Nahuatl or language, which is like the indigenous language of the Maya, or of the Aztecs, my bad.
So again, geographically speaking, obviously it has that name. It's the Gulf of Mexico, and it's been called that, I don't know, 400 years, right? Something like that. And so when we talk about this, and again, right now, as far as we know, there's nothing to change it. Like, if you want to call it that, you call it. Like, if the Gulf of Mexico is going to be called by Mexico the Gulf of Mexico, or the rest of the world wants to call it that, and we want to call it the Gulf of America, there's nothing wrong with it. My friend did have an interesting theory about it that I thought was kind of unique, was that Biden obviously, before he left his presidency, he had banned drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So if Trump names it the Gulf of America, can then he open up the banning to drill oil there? Because it's not technically the Gulf of Mexico anymore, it's the Gulf of America. So
that's kind of a spurious claim, kind of like saying that Russia shouldn't have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because Russia didn't receive a seat on the UN Security Council. The Soviet Union did, and Russia's not the Soviet Union. I don't think that would work. It's a fun thought, but
yeah, it's just unique.
Yeah, and there is some sort of like international authority on like naming bodies of water.
Yes.
And like America, the United States federal government can change it on our charts, but it does not dictate to the rest of the world that they will change it.
Yeah.
And I mean, like that's how the Arabs, like again, certain people, a lot of these, it's pretty interesting because like I don't see, it's almost like trying to create a conflict between the United States and Mexico that doesn't exist.
Right.
Because in a lot of these places, like the Arabs don't like the Persians, like Iran, right? Because Iran and Saudi Arabia essentially are fighting over who gets to have, influence over the Middle East. Is it the Shia Muslims or the Sunni Muslims? And so there's a lot that goes back and forth, and that, like, I guess the conflict makes sense, right? I can see that there's a clear, right, reason for the disparity, and in the same way, like you have the Sea of Japan,
right,
which is what Japan calls it,
right.
The Koreas don't call it that. No. North Korea has its preference, and South Korea prefers, I think it's the East Sea.
Yeah.
Because it's to the east of Asia, and they use the same. They're like, well, that's why the North Sea is called the North Sea, because it's north of Europe, right? So they try to use that justification. And so, like, I landed on a Google explained like how they on Google Maps, like what their how do they name stuff on their maps, and what they said is that they look at essentially where your internet's coming from, what country you're in, and what your country calls it, and it will essentially try and give you that. Or
interesting,
if there's numerous countries that use numerous names, they will put the different names closer to those countries.
Got it. Okay.
So I thought that was an interesting.
Yeah, that's really unique.
Yeah, I mean, but it's one of those things. I mean, like, it's things as minor as like a poorly drawn map of Barbie coming to the real world led to the ban of the release of the Barbie movie in Vietnam, because they said that it looked like what the Chinese perceived border. They thought it was a representation of a, Chinese border of the Southeast Sea, South China Sea, when they're like, no, in cartoons, when people travel, they make dashes as they move across maps.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I mean, like, not to make light of it. Oh, and there already is, or already has been, the Gulf of America.
Do tell. Where are we talking?
Russia.
There's a Gulf of America in Russia.
It doesn't currently go by the name Gulf of America. It goes by, I'm going to try my best. I don't speak Russian, so.
Yes.
Nakodka Bay.
Okay.
It's actually just above the Korean Peninsula in the Sea of Japan. But in 1959, a Russian corvette called the America with a K ducked out of a storm in that bay And so for a time, it was called, or for in that bay, so they called it the Gulf of America.
Okay.
And there's actually a city there that was established in 1907
Oh, even better.
called American, hold on, Americanaka. It's still there. It's on Google Maps. I
love that.
So I found it ironic that the first Gulf of America was in Russia.
Can we talk about how America also is like the America is named for Amerigo Vespucci, right? Like not like an American, like so when you say Gulf of America, that implies all the continents.
I would almost argue that logic makes more sense.
Yeah. It's like it's not a United States thing. It's the North American Gulf.
Yeah,
Like,
but if you read the White House webpage about this policy, it's not about that. It's about
no. It's about how the Gulf is essential to
purpose and policy. It is the national interest to promote the extraordinary heritage of our nation and ensure that future generations of American citizens celebrate the legacy of our American heroes. The naming of our national treasures, including breathtaking natural wonders and historic works of art, should honor the contributions of visionary and patriotic Americans in our nation's rich past. That is verbatim section 1.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't, like you said, Amerigo Vespucci is not an American.
No. Italian, right?
That would be my guess based on the name. He was a cartographer.
Yeah. It's interesting to me because it reminds me like a lot of this stuff. Yeah, Florence, Italy, and he died in Seville, Spain. It reminds me a lot of like just it's kind of like swinging back against some of the other stuff that we've talked about, where we've talked about we talked about Confederate monuments. I was trying to remember when we talked about that. I think it was like season 2, wasn't it, or was it season 1? One of those two. I know it was early.
Probably season 1, because that would have been like probably right around the summer of Black Lives Matter.
Okay, so but when we talked about that, right, we talked about how like what determines history, what makes up those points, and everything like that. And so to me, is this a counter run back to some of the stuff, right? Just to bring America to a more positive image, right? Like that's the whole goal. It sounds like from the start of that executive order. And so when we look at it, it's kind of like, oh, it's interesting to see those types of things. Is this going to happen? Now, the other thing I noticed in the thing though was it only really had 2 things that they were going to attempt to do, and it was the if I understand correctly, it's the Gulf of America and the Mount McKinley thing.
Reverting Denali to McKinley.
Yeah.
Yeah, like which is interesting because it talked about art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, historic works of art, but like there's no mention of any art at all in this executive order. But yeah, I don't write policy.
No,
for a reason. But yeah, like Mount McKinley was actually named Mount McKinley before McKinley was president. So it was named by a prospector who was up there in Alaska looking for gold while he was still a presidential candidate.
Oh, okay.
And then it was called McKinley in 1896, and then Woodrow Wilson signs a bill in 1917 to make it Mount McKinley National Park. And it has that moniker until 75, when the Alaska Board of Geographic Names changes it to Denali.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a push to try and get it in the U.S. like Board of Geographic Names to get it changed, but it's opposed by a congressman from Canton, Ohio, which is where McKinley is from, and it has continually been opposed by like John Kasich and other Iowa congressmen and senators because they're afraid it's taken the spotlight away from McKinley, who's apparently one of the famous Iowans. Oh, Ohioans?
Ohioans.
Ohioans.
Yeah.
Ohioites? I don't know.
Ohioans, I think, is what you're going for.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
My bad, Iowa.
Yeah. I was like, Iowa, I don't know if Iowa claims them or not. Yeah, it's interesting to look at some of these things and when I was in Alaska, so like I've been asked this about renaming the mountain and everything like that. When I was in Alaska, it was kind of an interchangeable thing, right? I think most people in the park, like that worked at the park, at the moment it's Denali National Park, called it Denali, right? But it wasn't. I don't know many people that went out of their way and got offended by if someone called it Mount McKinley. You know what I mean? Denali was used more than McKinley was. But again, it goes back to the idea of like you're changing it. Denali is meant to honor the indigenous people of Alaska. Like that's the whole goal of it. That's why you're calling it what they called the mountain, or I guess what would be interpreted in our English language as what their word was for the mountain.
Denali is derived from the, I'm going to do my best here, Koyukon Athabascans.
Okay.
It's present in 7 different languages in some form or shape that is similar to Denali,
Okay.
essentially meaning, and like when the Russians came over, they called it Bolshaya Gora, which just means big mountain.
Nailed it. Good job.
You know what I mean, like it's like it's the most imposing peak.
Yeah.
And so like in 2015, Obama passed an executive order to order his then Secretary of the Interior to change McKinley to Denali,
yep.
which was favored by pretty much every politician in Alaska,
yep.
regardless of party.
Yeah.
And in 2017, when they first floated the idea of reverting the name of the mountain back to McKinley, it was actually opposed by both Senators Murkowski and Sullivan, as well as Scott Kawasaki, who I believe is a state, might be a representative or like a state legislator. But like, so there's bipartisan support from Alaska to
keep it the same.
Keep it as Denali, which seems really odd that there's this push to change it when the people, like if we really want to talk about like populism and like listening to the people, like the people of Alaska would prefer that it be Denali.
Yeah.
And it gets kind of complex because they're changing, the executive order says that they should change the name of the mountain, but it won't change the name of the park. So I think they're trying to like split hairs with this one, where it's kind of like it gets to be called Mount McKinley, but it'll be Mount McKinley, like it's like the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim,
right,
in California.
Yeah.
So it's going to be Mount McKinley shall retain the name Denali National Park and Preserve.
Yeah.
In the Geographic Name and Information System.
Well, and I was thinking about this just because, and the biggest thing that, I think Trump has wants to rename it Mount McKinley is because McKinley's specialty was tariffs, and Trump's floated his idea of basing his economic agenda around the idea of tariffs. And it's not something we've done in a long time. We have tariffs, obviously, but not tried to really be aggressive with our tariffs around the world. And again, that's a different debate for a different day. That could be a whole other episode on talking about tariffs and the history of tariffs and things like that. But since McKinley's specialty was that, or economic plan was kind of based around that, that's his infatuation, I feel like, with this scenario, is he really just wants to honor the guy who shares the same economic principles that he's hoping to accomplish in this term. So
yeah, it says the justification on the White House website says President McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, heroically led our nation to victory in the Spanish-American War. Under his leadership, the United States enjoyed rapid economic growth and prosperity, including an expansion of territorial gains of our nation. President McKinley championed tariffs to protect U.S. manufacturing, boost domestic production, and drive U.S. industrialization and global reach to new heights. And then it talks about his assassination.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses that as kind of another justification for why he should be kind of like there should be a monument. Yeah, sorry, memorialized was the word I was thinking of there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, people complain that we changed it in the first place, and it's like, well, Alaska's essentially had changed it in the state of Alaska in 1975.
Yeah.
So Obama just came and had the federal government recognize what the state was doing.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of pushing back the other way, and like, yeah, I think there's been some political analysts that have said that like Trump might see himself as a similar president to McKinley, so it would make sense for him to
run
it back, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just kind of an interesting thing, and then like, I don't know, you have some cities throughout history, like you have Istanbul, which was Constantinople, which was Byzantium. And like it becomes difficult. Like, it can be confusing for students when you talk about stuff, because you talk about, like, today we talk about Turkey, and then we talk about I guess I always think like Turkey used to be like Anatolia.
Yep.
And then before it was Anatolia, if you go back to like the Roman Greco era, it was Asia Minor.
Yep.
It's the same place. It just had a different name at a different time.
I mean,
so
let's talk about Russia, man. Let's talk about Leningrad, Stalingrad, like
Volgograd.
Yeah, just rotating through. I was making the example, we were talking earlier, and it was something like when I went to Vietnam this summer with that group of kids, and our last days were in our last full 2 days were in Ho Chi Minh City, right? Which was obviously renamed. It was the capital. South Vietnam was called Saigon, and it was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the communist leader. And when we were there, right, the tour guide would sub out both. I mean, it was Ho Chi Minh City, it was Saigon. It didn't matter. Like, it was what locals called it Saigon, but obviously the government, being communist, wanted to honor Ho Chi Minh City, right? And I don't think nobody was offended by, again, going back to that thing, right? Like, people called it Saigon, people call it, and it still is, like, the airport is still the same airport code for Ho Chi Minh City is still Saigon. It's SIA, I think, to fly in. So, I mean, it's not, they didn't change any of that to, reflect it. But it's something that's interchangeable. It'll be interesting to see, because obviously if Alaska doesn't like this, Alaska is going to be the place that people go visit Denali National Park, but also the Alaskans are going to be the one who call it stuff. They're the ones who see it every day and not even see it. By the way, if you're ever lucky to go to Alaska and see Denali in its grace, because it is so high up that it actually creates kind of its own weather system. And so most days it is clouded. You can't see the actual mountain. And there's a couple days, like, I think we got 2 where the mountain was out, and it was just, it's incredible. It's no Everest obviously or anything like that, but it is a tall freaking mountain, and it is very cool to look at. It's very beautiful. So
if you're one of the ones of our followers that doesn't live in Washington and doesn't understand the phrase "the mountain is out,"
yes,
that means that there's no weather obstructing the view of the mountain. And I think about this because this weekend, Addie had a soccer game early, and we'd wasted some time. We were getting ready to go to Costco, and on the west side right now, it's been extremely cold, and there's been like 0 clouds in the sky. It's just been very stark, which is why it's so flippin' cold, because there's nothing to hold the heat in. But that also means that you get these beautiful views. Like, we were at Ridgefield looking at Mount St. Helens, and then being the history teacher, I was like, "Where's her sister?" And I'm like, "There's Mount Hood."
Yeah.
And I'm like, how do you know that that's Mount St. Helens? And then Emma's like, "Well, it's not pointy at the top." And I'm like, "Yep."
Ding-a-ling-a-ling.
She couldn't handle her temper and blew her top.
Yep. She blew our side technically, but we'll go with that.
Aneurysm and outside protection. But you know, but it's just one of those things that like growing up, even in Washington, like learning to appreciate. We both have lived on both sides of the state,
Yeah.
and I think Quincy School District does a great job of taking those kids. And a shout out to whatever the name of that company is.
Immers.
Sure, because I couldn't remember. We always argued about what it was called. We weren't quite sure.
Immers.
But they do a great job of taking the kids out to the coulees and then talking about like the ponds that were there like way back in the ancient like pre-human times.
Yep.
That left the oh Lord, I can always diatoms.
Yeah.
The little diatom skeletons out there that they harvest and they use
in everything.
You know, the and the scablands of Eastern Washington versus the rainforests and, you know, trees of Western Washington.
Well, even we talked about, I think before the show as well, that, you know, you think of like, so we're Denali being an indigenous people's name versus McKinley and everything like that. But like I remember specifically when the Seahawks made the Super Bowl, those 3 years that they did, right? The joke was always that they would have the other team try and read the names of Washington towns. And Squim was always on there, right? For those of you who don't know, it's Sequim. So everyone always says Sequim or something like that. But like I'm from a town that's named for indigenous, right? Like I'm from Puyallup, right? Which is named after the Puyallup tribe. Wenatchee, right? Where we both did a lot of our grocery shopping when we lived here. Spokane, one of our largest. Seattle, our largest city, is named for a chief, right? So it's I mean, Snohomish, Snoqualmie, you know, the list goes on and on and on.
Skamakaway, Wakayakum,
yep.
Cowlitz.
I mean, you can just keep going, and it's something that Washington's taken, and they've mixed it, right? Like we have counties that are named for indigenous people. We have counties that are named for presidents. We have counties that are named for our former governors and things like that. And so it's all just kind of mixed in together. And this is something that's kind of the balance. And it does say, I believe, in that White House order that the goal is the Department of Interior is working with Native Alaskans, right, to make sure that they're honored in other geographic monuments and things like that. Like they're not just trying to throw them completely out the window. They are, like you said earlier, where you're calling it Denali National Park still, but you're also changing just the name of the mountain. So
yeah, it's subpoint C under section 3.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's the reason for why they're renaming the mountain but keeping the park.
Yeah.
Denali, which the reason that's called Denali because the mountain's Denali, but whatever.
Correct.
But yeah, like talking about like even here in the Pacific Northwest, like the Seahawks, like there's people who do logo redesigns on social media for views, and one of the gals did the Seahawks, and a bunch of people were in an outrage, and they go, no, like you can't. She just kind of changed it to a random bird, and like there was a huge number of people that were like, you don't understand that this is actually influenced by Pacific Northwest Native American art, and like that's why it doesn't look like
it's a bird that doesn't.
It's not supposed to look real. It's supposed to be an artistic impression of, you know, like an osprey or something, right? Because it's part of what we do here. I think about the Seahawks logo and then like the good old like red and black like Vancouver Canucks.
Yeah.
Like the well, I guess it's like blue and green now, but like the orca.
Yeah.
The Canucks orca, you know, are the two pieces of. Well, I think, well, no, the Winterhawks have got away from that. They used to be that way, and then they've gone to something a little bit more realistic looking, rather than something that's more indicative of the art of the area.
Yeah. So. But again, it's a ever-changing landscape, and again, like from our standpoint, like we're looking at it like this is just something that President Trump felt that was necessary for his campaign to keep a campaign promise and to make this change. So it's interesting to see how it'll play out, like to see what Alaska thinks overall about it, because it's an executive order. So in theory, it doesn't need, you know, congressional approval or anything like that. And I don't know there's no grounds for a lawsuit to stop it or anything like that. So, I mean,
I think the only thing that would happen is that the Alaska, right, geographic naming information, they're just going to keep calling it Denali.
yeah,
Is what they can do in spite of that. And it could be something that we just, every time the political party shifts in the White House, we executive order and change it back and forth, which would be kind of silly.
but it'll also be why like Alaska just calls it Denali, right? Like it's because they're not going to get involved in that shift back and forth. So. And like you'll see it. The other thing you'll see it is you'll see it on like when you go to Department of the Interior. So you go to the National Park website and things like that. They'll make that switch to McKinley, and you'll see it on the official paperwork of things that are at that national park. But you might not see it, you know, if you're a private customer or you're at a private business. So, but
I think that one will be. I think the change of the naming the mountain will change quicker, and honestly might have more people fired up
mm,
because it is kind of a historic thing where he's saying he's trying to take it back to what it was in 1917 or 1896, and people in Alaska are saying, well, we're calling it what it was called like for hundreds, if not thousands of years prior to that.
yep.
Where like the Gulf of America, it's I don't know, that it's never been called that before. Maybe it's a new thing. Does it change the water? No.
Nope.
You're still gonna, yeah, it's not gonna change the weather. You're still gonna have hurricanes.
Yep. And if
So
you go to New Orleans, you can also get the drink called a hurricane. So, but
so I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's it. It's those are the two big name changes, and it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out and see like the impact. Again, we both teach history, our social studies, I should say, and that impacts us with geography is one of our main core subjects that we need to teach and we need to instill in our kids and everything like that. And so it'll be interesting to see. Like, I mean, I'll have to kind of I think I'll bounce back, but right now the map on my wall says Gulf of Mexico because I don't not many people are shelling out money for brand new maps that pull down as much as I love mine. So,
when I taught in Kuwait, we bought American produced textbooks, and then would the Ministry of Education, because it was a British
oh,
influence
okay.
system, um, they got a copy and they would tell us what we needed to modify.
Oh,
And one of the things was we had to pay people to sit there with a pen and cross out Persian Gulf and write Arabian Gulf and cross out Israel and say occupied Palestine.
really? Oh,
Yeah. Oh, they're
no,
Middle
no, no. That
East,
makes sense where
strong
you at.
feelings.
Uh-huh. No, no, 100%. But that's just interesting to me. I don't think I've ever heard you tell that story about that. So,
Well, I generally talked about we had to draw hot pants on the discus thrower. So 150 copies, 150 pair of hot pants on the discus thrower.
yep. Can't look at that.
No, but that was all done by hand with Sharpies and
Yeah. And it wasn't kids like writing in your textbooks. It was kids. It was adults trying to make sure
it
everything.
had to be done before the kids could look at the textbook.
Yep. Yep. So, well, okay. Bark, anything else?
No, I think I'm all geographied out for today.
Okay. I have one more final thought, and I feel like you're going to add on to it. So, um, with everything that's going on right now, as of Monday, right, there are a lot of hot feelings everywhere, right? The biggest thing that Barker and I feel like do a really good job of talking about is just take care of one another, right? Regardless of where you're at on this whole thing, right? If you're happy, if you're upset, right? The biggest thing is looking out and taking care of each other and looking out for people and making sure that everyone's okay. That's one of the things. And even if it wasn't a presidential election year or an inauguration or anything like that, right? Like we always want you out there looking for each other and taking care of each other. So that's probably one of my big stresses right now for everyone.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those like it doesn't cost anything to be nice.
Yep.
Um,
DBJ,
and
man.
yeah, DBJ. I mean that's like the core tenet of my classroom, right? Don't be a jerk. Um, always try and be considerate of the people around you, and that somebody might not share your feelings on certain issues. Like a lot of people in the country aren't happy that Kansas City is playing this weekend.
Oh, good Lord. The
Uh,
refs.
some people are, and a lot of people aren't. So yeah, just be kind and be human to other humans. Just be good people.
That's all we can ask. So, all right, guys. Until next time, I'm the Turn.
I'm the bark.
And we're going to be here a long, long time. Have a good night, everybody.
Hold on.
Be
Be safe.
and you guys be well. We'll see
Yeah,
you.
yes. I thought, man, I bungled that hard.
Hey, you're okay. You're tired. We're guys. If you don't know this, we're pushing this 11:45. We had a lot to talk about because we didn't get to see each other last week. So, hey, you guys be safe and be well, and we'll see you next week.